Hello, welcome back. Moderating our next panel is Michael Pietsch, the Executive Vice President and Publisher of Little Brown & Company. He has worked with such writers as Martin Amis, Rick Moody, Walter Mosley, Stacy Schiff, Alice Sebold, David Sedaris, and of course David Foster Wallace, among many others, and with cartoonist R. Crumb. I am very pleased to welcome Michael Pietsch.
Hello. I am very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome two wonderful writers who are going to join me in a conversation about writers on David Foster Wallace. And the two writers who have been kind enough to join us are Elizabeth Crane and Amanda Eyre Ward. Elizabeth is the author of three story collections, When the Messenger is Hot, All This Heavenly Glory, You Must Be This Happy to Enter. And she'll publish her first novel in June of this year, is that correct? Which is called We Only Know So Much. Among other awards, she is a recipient of the Chicago Public Library's 21st Century Award. When I met her, she lived in Chicago, but she now lives in Austin and teaches at
UCR Palm Desert Low Residency MFA.
There you go. Amanda Eyre Ward has published 4 novels, Sleep Towards Heaven, How to Be Lost, Forgive Me, and Close Your Eyes, and one story collection called Love Stories in This Town, and has received starred reviews, awards, movie options, and other honors, too numerous to detail here. So I'll just say that her most recent novel was named one of Kirkus's best books of the year 2011 and was Elle Magazine's Book of the Year. Thank you for being here today, this morning, this afternoon. I hope this will be as conversational as possible, and in my perfect world, I just left one perfect question that you two then back and forth for about an hour, and then we open it up to questions. We'll see how that goes. But I wanted to start by asking you both if you can remember the first time you read something written by David Foster Wallace and what it felt like to you, and were you writing at the time, and how, well, just start the first part. But what's the first thing you read by him?
I'll jump in on that. It was about 1989 or 90. It was shortly after Broom of the System had come out. And I was working at a talent agency, sort of out of the mailroom. And there was another friend of mine there who was also working in the mailroom, who's now a big-time agent there. And he said, we talked about, I guess we must have talked about books. And so he said, I have a book for you to read. And I think this is going to be up your alley. And so I read it, and it forever altered the course of my universe. It blew the top of my head off, and it really kind of it can't be understated what reading that book had meant to me. I hadn't, as people have been talking about already, I hadn't read anything like it, and I just didn't know that could even be done. And so it besides just being a phenomenally entertaining reading experience, it made me realize that I could do what I wanted to do,
At that time, were you doing what you wanted to do?
No. Well, I mean, in terms of my writing, but my writing at that time was very sort of careful, and I can't even compare it to anyone, but it was very kind of straightforward and didn't feel really natural. And just seeing what he did with the voice already in that early work, it made me understand that was something that was very kind of a natural thing that I had going for me that I could bring to my own work, not to be like him, but that seeing that he brought that layer to it, that I could do that in my own way.
And this is a layer of voice.
Yeah.
And is there any moment in that book that you remember as like the one that really just made your head explode?
I don't think so. I think there was just everything about it. It reminded me, in some ways, I mean, this is a weird thing to say probably, but it reminded me in some ways of some of my favorite things that I had read as a kid, just in the playfulness of it. Mm-hmm. The character names, and the humor. things like that. It was more sort of like the details and the voice and things like that than any one particular moment.
And at the time, the novel was not widely known. There was no. Did it
No.
remind you of anything other than of any other contemporary or literary novels? It was
No,
just,
no.
it
I
seemed
mean,
singular.
you know, just a sort of like backstory on my reading history. I'm very slow in terms of getting a hold of good, or I was slow at the time of getting a hold of good literature. And so, you know, every 5 years or something, I would read something really good, you know. And I read good stuff in school, but then I didn't know how to find it. And I didn't hang around with writers, or I suppose I hung around with people who read, but it was few and far between that I would read something that I really loved, and then I didn't know how to find the next thing that I loved. So I'd wait for an author to write another book, and you know, which I did with Wallace, you know, and I mean, and I think that explains why I hadn't read anything like that before, you know, just reading like V.C. Andrews or whatever.
Well, those are important books too.
It's true.
Good stuff.
Amanda, and you?
Well, the first thing I read by David Foster Wallace was, and they were talking about this in the previous panel, about the first 70 pages of Infinite Jest. I read it, the first 70 pages, about 70 times. And I kept picking it up, and people would tell me to read it, and I would get stuck because I don't think I gave myself permission not to understand everything he was doing. So it took me a while, until actually about 6 months ago, that I gave myself the permission to move forward, to just say, maybe I don't understand everything or even 90% of what he's doing, but God, I enjoy this and I'm loving it. And then I finally embraced not understanding it and just had the most wonderful reading experience reading Infinite Jest.
You let yourself be befuddled.
Exactly.
I think I calculated at one point that you were 380 pages into Infinite Jest before you've actually met all the characters. But once you've met them, then he does a lot with them. The loops and whorls and convolutions of the internal conversations we're all carrying around inside our heads all the time. I sometimes think that this is what David captured better than any writer who has ever lived. Do you feel that David is inside your heads in any way as you're trying to write? In particular, to write an internal monologue? Has he affected you?
I think ever since I have read Infinite Jest, it's all I've wanted to talk about to anyone. It's all, I think about it all the time, not just in my writing life, but in my real life. And my husband can attest, I most nights read various pieces aloud again, just for the sheer pleasure of it. Wow. And so I have actually been editing a book, going back and working on it. And I think I write quite minimalist fiction. And one thing I've started to do is to just add a few more moments with the characters. I'll let their thoughts go on a little longer. And I never let myself do that. I cut to the bone. But I guess having David Foster Wallace in my head has enabled me to just give them a few more moments in that room. Just hold on.
That's wonderful. So your editing is additive.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
That's great.
Totally different.
Mine is probably too as well. And I, you know, I think for me too, I know, particularly after having read Infinite Jest and some of his nonfiction, that sort of conversational aspect to it, or the rambly kind of asides and tangential things, just it did speak to me. It just felt so like, oh, this is how the mind works, and so yes, I mean it's there all the time, I think, for sure.
Now you are both women who write fiction. I mentioned last night that when I noticed that. The writing fiction part first. I mentioned last night that when I met David, I said to him how much I admired the female character in his construction of the interior of female characters. That felt very true to me, revealing to me as a male reader. But I wondered if you would agree with that observation, or whether you feel that his female characters are as strong to you as some of his male characters.
I think so.
I find that I relate more to the male characters, actually, in his work. So I don't know. I haven't really thought about it.
I think it's something that I haven't thought about. I mean, you know, but to answer the question, I do think that it's a sort of a broad. I've never separated them out by gender. You know, I just think like they all seem so fully drawn and so real and human to me. Even when they are, things are sort of over the top. Yeah, so I wouldn't split them up in that
Also the way that he
necessarily.
writes about relationships between women and men, between men and men, between men, everybody. They're just all, it's so interconnected, so thoughtful and nuanced. So I think regardless of the characters, the way they interact is so moving. Their attempts to reach each other.
Mm.
It's heartbreaking, really.
Yes. Now, you mentioned in your editing process, I wonder if you have any stories or anything you've written that you look back now and think, wow, I was definitely reading David Wallace really hard at that point.
As you probably recall, yes, in my first book, I have stories that have footnotes. I mean, there's just no, there's no, and it's not that he's the only person that's ever, he wasn't the first person to do this, but he was certainly the one that's where I was getting it from. And, on the one hand, it felt very organic to me. It just felt like, it wasn't like, oh, I'm trying to be Wallace. I certainly don't think that that's, this is ridiculous. But at the same time, it did feel very kind of natural to me. It felt like, oh, I have all these extra thoughts and I'm going to make this story within a story and whatever. Having worked on that book that has those footnoted stories in it at Little Brown, and knowing that you guys had Wallace, it was a discussion that I had with my editor, Reagan, about, I don't know how much you would know about our conversations, but we talked about it, and actually there's one story that probably has more footnotes than actual text, narrative text. So that one we couldn't kind of tweak, but and there's one that has maybe 2 footnotes or something, but the rest there were several more that had them, and then we kind of rejiggered them and worked with parentheses. And so that's kind of more my thing now.
Because
and I've left them alone for that. You're never going to be favorably compared to David Foster Wallace. And so I was like, maybe it's best for me to just sort of step back.
Well, I think the parenthetical there's a lot of room to expand in there.
Yeah.
You can own that.
I'll take that on. People can say that's Crane-esque, whatever.
And Amanda, anything that you've written that you feel was particularly under the influence?
I mean, really, once you start thinking that way with the parenthetical asides, or allowing yourself to think that way, once you read David Foster Wallace and think, this sort of thinking can be put on the page, it's hard not to try. I have failed at every attempt, so there's never been anything published.
The trick is making it relevant and somehow bringing it back to where you started, and not losing your reader by the end of the sentence, or all those kinds of practical issues as a writer.
And he got off the footnotes and endnotes at various points. I was just reading his letter to David Markson out in the case outside, and there's not a footnote, or I don't think even a parenthetical, but the loops and the suppleness of varieties of expression within his prose was just astounding.
Well, the other thing that I think, I've been trying to encourage more people I know to read him, and one way not to be so scared is to understand that he also wrote enormous realistic pieces. I mean, many of the chapters do not do a lot of extremely complicated game playing, and that's something to love if you're someone that might not understand or enjoy trying to figure out some of the pyrotechnics. And so I think some of his just straight novel chapters, the set pieces, are just as moving as Updike, or he has a lot in common with him, actually, in some ways.
You said you were talking with other writers about David's work. As a colleague working among other writers, is he someone who comes up for discussion often? Is he sort of in people's thinking about their work?
I think so, but I also do find that there's some people who absolutely love him. They've read everything he's written. They want to talk about it all the time. And then there are people who say they really haven't tried him at all. And I think that's why there's this strange accessibility question where people feel like if you're not going to understand everything and dive in, maybe you shouldn't even try. And I don't understand that. Well, I do, because I fell prey to it for many years. But I think that people are afraid that there's a lot of people out there who would love David Foster Wallace if they just push on past the 70 pages. And
I
Yeah.
think that's true. I find it to be much more accessible in that way. As you say, like if you just sort of like go in and not worry about what you get or don't get, that you can have an amazing reading experience. But I think
feel
people are
guilty
intimidated.
doing
You see
that or
1,000
something.
pages and you're,
Yeah.
you know, you
It's
can be intimidated.
intimidating.
Yeah.
it is intimidating.
I give those readers a copy of the essay, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, and say this is the gateway drug to infinite jest. Once you've experienced this,
Yeah.
it'll take you straight in, and you'll never
Well,
come
and
back.
when you talked about the Pale King, and the fact is that it is numerous set pieces that you had to figure out how they all fit together, but you can also enjoy the set pieces as you go along before you figure, and it was very interesting to me that you had to decide at what point the reader would understand that the younger characters were the older characters later. But you can enjoy the pieces along the way before you figure that out.
Yes, absolutely. Now, as readers, I wonder what you think about David's influence on other writers. I mean, it's clear that he was influenced by these gargantuan novelists, among many others, but Joyce and Pynchon. Do you see his influence out in the world? Do you see people who do you feel that he's changed the fiction that we're reading?
I do, do you?
Who do you?
Yeah, I want to hear what you.
Well, I mean, one particular person that comes to mind is Adam Levine. I don't know if you've read any of his work. And I have a little story.
What's the big novel you said? It's called
The Instructions.
The Instructions. That's right.
And I think, you know, he's another person who is very much himself, but who, you know, I share the sort of geeky fandom with. And actually, my little Adam Levine story is that we were neighbors in Chicago back 10 or some years ago, and he was a social work student at the time, but he was writing, and I went out on my back porch, and I looked sort of down diagonally. I saw this guy, I hadn't met him yet, and he was reading Infinite Jest, and I was like, oh, I read that. And he's like, this is the second time I'm reading it. And I know he's read it numerous times since then. But his, and I, you know, we traded stories for a while, and I'm reading his stories back then. He has a very similar sort of natural sensibility. Knowing him as a person, his sensibility is, you know, very, just, he's a chatty guy, you know, it's super smart. And so I think you can definitely see his influence. And I mean, that's just what one, you know, and he wrote this book that's 1,000 pages, and I think, you know, you can't miss the sort of, and it's blue, you know? But I think, and that's just one example.
Should we talk to our lawyers?
No.
I think there's a lot of readers looking for someone like David Foster Wallace to read, and I don't know who. I see people saying a lot of the time, I'm a huge fan of David Foster Wallace. What should I read next? It's a hard question.
Well, I think the thing is that the trickle down is not so necessarily so obvious. I hope to God, other than like my little footnote moment, that it's not like that his influence isn't obvious in my own work. The influence is just that I was moved to write, you know? Not so much that I was moved to try to write like somebody else.
I also found inspiring his attempt to be honest, just so naked on the page and so sad sometimes. I've just found it tremendously moving, and I think that's what we're all looking for, a book where an author is being that honest and trying to connect to you as a reader. And I haven't found a book yet that's done it, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to write it.
Well, one thing he did, among the many things he did, he really resisted the conventional redemptive conclusion to a novel. I mean, he just would not. I wonder if you have an idea about if you have thought about why he did that, why his endings were so unusual, why they were so in the middle of something, and whether you think that's something, that formal aspect is.
Well, my humble opinion about that is that that's life. That's what I think. I mean, maybe that's a really simplistic answer, but that's one of the things that really appeals to me. You know, I read something, and I am a person who just like finished Infinite Jest and would have happily read more. Now I can come here and read more. But you know, that's what that's what interests me as a writer, and these are discussions that I have with editors about, like, well, you need to have more of a resolution with this character, or something needs to happen. It's like, you know, why that, you know, why can't it just be gray in the end, you know?
I love that answer. Did you ever thought about that?
I think, well, I'm thinking about it now. And one of the interesting things I found just coming to this symposium, when I was listening to you, Michael, speak last night about some of the objectives David had with his work, some of the ideas he wanted to get across. He wanted to explore boredom. He wanted to explore entertainment. I guess as a writer, I always come at it from the character. And so it was very interesting to me that he not only asked himself to follow the arc of a character fully, but also was trying to make larger statements and explore larger objectives. And that's really hard to do both. So I think, yes, it's realistic for characters that the endings are not always complete and the arc isn't always perfect. But also, I guess it is, maybe he was, I don't know, I would ask you, was he also fighting with trying to make a larger statement with his work, and so he had to end in that way?
It's because it was a Freytagian triangle, is how he explained the structure of Infinite Jest, and I still don't quite understand what that is. But I think...
what did he call it?
It's a Freytagian triangle, I think.
Freytagian triangle.
It's like the letter Bonnie mentioned last night. He liked to make it very clear sometimes that he knew a lot more than we mere drudges of the publishing world do. But I think I'm sympathetic to what you said. I felt that the ending of Infinite Jest, when I first encountered it and then encountered it again and again, sent me back just going, what? That's the end. And what does it make you do? It makes you go back and dig inside the work. And I think it's the point you made. This is life, and the life is in what's happening all through it, and not through some summary moment that I think that he resisted. He resisted
summary. In fact,
summary.
when I finished Infinite Jest, I said on Twitter, I just finished Infinite Jest, and my friend Matt said, go right now and start reading it again. Like you have right after you finish the last chapter, start it again.
It's I've meant to read it again too, and I've only ever read it once. But it was such a commitment to. At that time, I was working outside the house, and carrying it around. Was such a it ended up that I had my own, like I had a separate little backpack for a copy of Infinite Jest, and it took me 2 months. And
experiences of reading.
Well, but it took me 2 months to read that book the first time. So now, if I'm going to do it again, I still need a chunk of time to really devote to it.
The nice thing about the digital age is that you can now carry it around in your pocket in your iPhone. It's there.
I may just do that.
And the end notes work really well. You just touch the note, it takes you to the note, and then you touch the end, it takes you right back to the place in the text. So there are actual real advantages.
But I loved what I heard, that the German version came with 2 ribbons, so you can keep track.
No, I wish that was a very wise idea. Huh? I'm sure I wish I'd thought of it. David wrote often about characters living through very difficult circumstances, through depression, addiction. His death and this Dan Max's biography that we heard about this morning is going to show how much more than any of us realize his work drew on personal emotional experience of his. There is this popular idea that equates genius with torment. And do you think that's a valid idea? Do you think that's a popular fiction because we can't understand? We're reading him now after his death in the context of suicide.
Genius, at that level, maybe, I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I was telling Betsy earlier that one of the things I found so interesting about Infinite Jest was the pieces in the AA meetings, and how tormented the character of Gately was about the fact that the platitudes, what he saw as platitudes and he understood were simple statements of AA, brought him so much peace. And that torment alone I found really interesting, that he was there saying, I know that let go and let God is a really dopey sentiment, and yet I feel that if I could do that, it would bring me solace. And I found that an interesting point.
There's another little moment like that in Good Old Neon, where the moment where the thing from Cheers, where he talks about how, like, there was like a moment where a character, like the character of Frasier, I think, makes some offhanded comment, and he, you know, everybody laughs, and it was a rerun of Cheers, and then he connects with this great truth that Frasier from Cheers has put forth, and then he goes down this whole rabbit hole of how, you know, that's what it comes down to, that like this sort of really mundane thing that everybody could connect to, and it's a similar sort of example. You know, I don't know that I don't. It's so impossible to know. I mean, I will say this. I think the tormented artist is sort of a myth, and I don't think, you know, it didn't work well for me. I personally put out, my output is better the less tormented I am, but I'm not a genius. So I don't know. I mean, it's you know, I always, you know, one of the things that I was sort of interested in him, thinking about him as a person, was what is it like to walk around with that brain? You know, that you have to know is so different from even probably the smartest other people that you know. And I don't really have the answer to that question, but it's something I've thought about quite a bit.
Also, when you're writing about difficult things, it's painful, obviously, but what he did so often was just, he would not look away. If a character was in pain or saw someone else in pain, you know, we all see that in our everyday lives. You get on the bus and you think, God, that bus driver, what a job. That must be really hard. But he would stay with that and feel that and write about it and focus on it. And the days that I keep myself from turning away from those thoughts are not my happiest days.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
So you
true.
feel he expands your sympathy for the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it must have been hard on him to do so, to teach us these things.
It's that I'm not asking this question well, but what I'm trying to get at is kind of, I think, something this symposium and the Ransom Center collection gets at, which is how does death inform his work? How do you see his work differently since his death than you did while he was living?
You know, having just done a little refresher before this, I mean, you know, it's been talked about some, not necessarily here, but I've read numerous things in the interim, and you know, it was something I felt sort of aware of, just knowing what little I knew about him, that he wasn't writing totally without having his own experiences that he was bringing to the table. You know, it's I guess for me as a reader somewhat more poignant to go back and read these things and you know, think how much closer a lot of it was.
You see his struggle to find joy in the ordinary. You see that on every page, how hard he struggled. And I think, yeah, knowing that it was too much for him is very hard to know when you're reading it now, in a way that it wasn't when he was still struggling. There was an interesting essay that we were talking about last night that Jonathan Franzen wrote about going birding with him. Mm-hmm. And he looks up and says, "Hey, Dave, look at that bird over there. Isn't it beautiful?" And I guess David at the time just sort of looked away and didn't really say anything.
He said, "It's pretty."
He said it was pretty.
Yeah, it's pretty.
And Franzen said, I think in the end that was the difference. I felt joy looking at that bird and David didn't.
Speaking of joy, if you were trying to entice someone to come read David who had not, is there a particular joyful moment in one of his stories or novels that you would point them to, or essays? Is there a peak moment?
So many.
Well, there's the cruise ship essay, which is the funniest thing in the world.
And the saddest too, but more funny.
It is really sad.
Yeah.
But when he, at one point on the cruise ship, I'm sure you've all read it, but when he can't figure out how his room is cleaned because he makes up
the mints on the pillow.
The same
oh my God,
time,
yeah.
And he hides in the corridor to try to see who the hell is going in the room and cleaning it, and he never finds out. And I found that hilarious. And then I have a strange sense of humor, but I was just reading my husband the fierce baby section from The Pale King, because it is just hilarious that this guy's saying, looking at that baby just really affected me for the rest of my work period or something. It's just, there's also it's just hilarious.
I think the humor, even in the, the joy for me is the humor, whatever the subject matter that he's dealing with. You make me, reading to your husband. I remember reading parts of Infinite Jest to my dad, and the one passage in particular that I remember reading was the on the failure of the video phone.
Oh yes.
And which had just made me just rolling on the floor laughing, and so.
But he gets you, because then you can be reading an essay like Consider the Lobster, and the cover is so inviting of that book with the lobster raising its claw, and you're saying, oh, ha, ha, there he is at the lobster festival, and it's so funny, and it's the guy driving him and these fat people from Maine, and it's just a laugh riot. And then he starts talking about the lobsters screaming and the other side of it, and within a page you're just close to tears about how sad it all is. And
we listened to it, my husband and I listened to that in the car sometime after I'd read it the first time, and we listened to him reading it. And I think it was after his death.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
It was, and I love lobster, but I was just like, oh man, yeah.
Two footnotes. I just want everyone to understand that when Amanda is reading the story about the fierce baby to her husband, they have a 3-month-old at home. So that's a really interesting thing to picture.
And it's at 2 in the morning.
Terrifying. Yeah. And the other is, I might as well confess it because it's all in the archives, and everyone will probably already does know this. In editing Infinite Jest, I would constantly look for things that came out whole without the whole thing collapsing. And among the cuts I suggested was taking out this section on video telephony. Brilliant though it was. Brilliant though it was. And just to assure you, David said, no fucking way. I've read this aloud, and people really laugh. It stings. So.
Somebody was saying that the idea of giving the entertainment to Gately was in there originally.
Pardon me?
That originally they were going to give the entertainment to Gately at the end of Infinite Jest.
That was an ending?
In one of the, that was one of the chapters.
I certainly never saw an ending that included that. No, he had directed me to footnote 137b sub c, which is where the plot is actually resolved, because I didn't understand. So if you had infinite time to prowl the Ransom Center David Wallace collection, what would you be looking for? What would you hope to find? What interests you?
I would look at letters. I mean, the letters just, they kind of, I would probably look at everything, but I would look at the letters, and I think I've hesitated to, because they're the few that I've read have just been so emotionally crushing to me. The one that comes to mind that I have read, I think, is on the internet. But there was an event here when the archive first came, and a friend of ours read a letter that he wrote to DeLillo. I think it was pre-Infinite Jest, and I remember, I've sort of made a habit of writing to some of my favorite writers over the years, and I've actually gotten to know. I mean, it's been a wonderful thing. I've gotten to know some of these people. It's fantastic. We like hearing from people, as it turns out. But he was the person that I, adored the most, but feared writing to the most, because I thought, he's going to see right through me, and he's going to see that I have a giant crush on him, and that I'm stupid, and blah, blah, blah. And so here was this letter to DeLillo that, I mean, I'm sure he didn't have a crush on DeLillo, but, he basically wrote the smart David Foster Wallace version of the letter that I would have written to him. Mm-hmm. And it just broke my heart, because I thought, he would have written me back, And, just even reading the letters that are in the lobby just really are just so moving to me. And so I kind of feel like, well, okay, am I going to go and sob for a while? Am I willing to sort of like bring a box of tissues and do that. I should, because we're not going to be here that much
I
longer.
recommend this.
Yeah.
I, for some reason, am less interested in his letters and more interested, and this is going to sound funny as someone who couldn't get past page 70 for 10 years, I want to read more Infinite Jest.
Everyone wants to read more.
I
Infinite
want to read
Jest.
more
Yeah, well, I would
about
definitely do
why
that, too.
you all made the decisions you made, the process, the scenes I haven't read. I just want more.
Once you've read the novel, you do want more. It is true, and there is more. That's I mean, it's an unusual thing that the entirety of a work like this could be available to scholars and the public so soon after its publication. I think it's a spectacular accomplishment of the Ransom Center that they've made it so accessible so fast.
Also, your process with him was so amazing. I was saying to Betsy, it's just a dream, to be able to have an editor who spends that amount of time reading and rereading your work, writing to you about it, that all of that is there is also a testament to an editor-author relationship that's increasingly rare, I think.
I don't think it was his dream come true when he got a letter from me when he thought we were done. I thought we were done. And I wrote a letter saying, actually, I have to start over and go through it again, because I realized I just really gotten it up in my head, and to call that editing, it was not true to it. So I wrote him a kind of heartfelt letter just saying, David, I have to. I hope you'll trust me. I just need to go back through one more time. And I expect Bonnie and Adele received some phone calls in the wake of that. Or perhaps there are some letters that are in the file as well, because that can't have been an early, easy thing to hear. But as I said last night, it was the great experience of my life as an editor to get to engage with a writer of that manifold delightfulness. It was a profound experience, but it was hard. So do you have a favorite character that you return to again and again? Are you in love with Gately? Are you in love with Hal?
I do love Gately. I do.
Does everybody love Gately best?
Gately's up there for sure. One of the stories that I've read again and again, because I assign it to undergrads when I have them, is Forever Overhead. And so that kid is one that I kind of is very close to my heart.
Yeah, I love Gately. He's the one I relate the most to. But there's a lot of characters in those AA meetings that are pretty phenomenal.
Well, and I should also say that one of the stories I reread before this that I had read a number of times, but I hadn't read in a long time, was The Depressed Person. And and that was a story I remember when the first time I read it, I was like, oh my God, this is my friend, and this is, it was so easy to connect to, like, this person, like, this is, like, he knows my girlfriend, and then this time when I read it, I was like, wow, this is so much more like me. I think they're, like, as kind of completely messed up as that character is, as you were talking about with the, the sort of, like, truth of I mean, there are people like that, and I think that the emotional kind of truth to that story, and that, according to things that I've read, like, that was a controversial story. Some women thought that it was portraying women poorly. That was not a thought in my head. I'm all for reading anything that I feel rings true. And if that portrays a type of a person in a bad light, people are messed up. So all kinds of people are messed up, including women. That it wasn't an issue for me, but it was interesting reading it, at a different time in my life, and just seeing how much I actually connected to the character myself, and it was because of the emotional, the way that it just felt like really emotionally raw. That character is just like not, it's just is struggling, but it's just like basically can't help being herself, and so that's one.
I love Gately because he's trying to figure out how to live, and I find that a really amazing thing to read about someone, and he's just trying so hard. And I also wanted to say the character that I love, because it must have been a character, is the hilarious David Foster Wallace that goes on the cruise ships, the one who's just hiding in the hallways, and that, to some extent, I'm sure was him, but also is this wonderful character that I love reading.
I think I imagine a little bit that Gately was a sort of self that David had inside him, that this sort of big, uncomplicated, but damaged Midwestern lunk with a big heart was definitely a piece of him. Oh, he's
My
not Midwestern.
favorite part of the book is when he
a Midwestern heart. Sorry.
he realizes that if Gately can just stay in the moment and not send his brain out over the ramparts to see what's ahead or what's behind and just exist in that space, then he can make it to the next space.
Yeah.
I have goosebumps even reading. I was underlining, like, that's how, okay, thank
That's
you.
how,
Thank you,
that's
Gately.
how, yeah. Now, you've touched on this in your conversation, the conversation about the depressed person, but along with these great human moments of brilliance and comic warmth, there is terror and there is horror in these pages. And one of those stories, I think, is still one of his stories is still one of the most horrifying things I've ever read. Are there moments in reading him that you just found terrifying, or too dark to bear, too difficult to take in?
There are things I wish I hadn't read. Definitely, I wish
No,
I
I'm
didn't
into
have
it.
in my head.
I mean, I can't imagine what that would be for me as a reader. I want to go there. It's, and I mean, I was actually talking to a neighbor about this, but we were sort of having a conversation about loss, and I like to read kind of sad things when I'm sad. Again, if they ring true, it's this thing, and I think this is one of the things that Wallace was always trying to get at. It makes me feel less alone. It doesn't have to be the exact same experience as mine to make me feel like the sort of capacity we have for feeling and the multitude of feelings that a person can have, that someone else has had those things. Like, I'm there. I'm totally down.
Some of the bodily stuff hurts me. The boy who was trying to touch every part of his body with his lips when he blows his spine out. It hurts to read that. And the microwave and the dog behind the car. It hurts physically, even to think about.
Well, you talked about the living second by second, 1 second at a time. That in the very first story of his that I've seen, which has been will be in the collection of Uncollected Fiction, there's a story published in Amherst, the Amherst Review, when he was an undergraduate, about a young man who was living with clinical depression and writing about that experience as every cell in your body experiencing nausea every second of your life, unable to move beyond it. Just this feeling, expressing the pain second by second, and then Gately sort of showing at a later point him trying to find a way to survive that.
And Kate Gompert, I feel like.
Kate
was
Gompert.
Kate is, yeah.
feeling
It's a
that.
lot of difficult. For me, the one of the most terrifying things I've ever read is a story, the final story in the collection titled Oblivion, which is a story whose title is, I'm sure you all remember, and I'm forgetting right now. Can you remind me, please? The Suffering Channel. The Suffering Channel, in which an artist, there is an artist whose art is, he shits it out. He shits out masterpiece sculptures. And the questions raised by this that David was raising is art merely an excrescence? Do I have any choice but to create this? I seem not to be able to stop myself from creating this thing that seems to be of so much value to everyone. Is it really nothing more than just what comes out of me because of who I happen to be? This absolute abnegation of value of art terrified me. That made me just think thoughts I'd never thought before. But there are a lot of places in his work that take you places you would never have gone on your own, and that is his great one of his great accomplishments and the value of art. It helps you understand things you would not have understood on your own, or at least approach things you would not have even knew existed on your own. So if David were here, is there a question that you would like to ask him? What's the question that you would like to ask him, Amanda? That's such a talk show question. I'm sorry.
No, it's a great question.
It is. It's almost like a.
Will you start? What would you like?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm not asking myself.
I would like to ask him for some books to read, what he loved, what books he'd recommend I should read starting tonight.
That's great. Well, that is a benefit of the Ransom Center because he answers that question in letter after letter.
Oh, fantastic.
He's always talking about books that he loves. So you'll get a lot of great reading advice from him. And also the correspondence includes him asking other writers those same questions. And so you get the recommendations that some other great writers gave him of books to read.
And I love that all the syllabi are there. They were talking about this at the last panel, that you could essentially take one of his classes by grabbing the syllabi and then seeing his books with his notes in the books.
His notes and his students' papers.
Yes.
The devotion with
faces.
which he responded to his students' work.
Yeah,
will just
amazing.
Fill you up. It'll just make
Yeah.
you incredibly
those are
happy
really-
for the world that his students got the benefit of his attention to that degree.
I just feel like it's funny. You'd think like all these years of thinking about him that I would have like had a question prepared. I sort of go to the post-death question, which is the unanswerable question, like why, and that's just not
We could also
possible.
ask him for a dispatch. Yeah, what's it like over there?
Oh,
Probably more interesting than
that
what should
would be
I read
good.
tonight.
That would be good.
I'm given the question of what is the afterlife, and instead I ask him, what should I read
Or
tonight?
David's anything good on TV
Is
tonight?
there a God? How about that?
So do you think he's teachable? Do you think that students can benefit from reading him? You mentioned that you do have talk with students. about
Well,
him.
yeah. I mean, I have told them to read Supposedly Fun Thing, even though I teach fiction, and I teach workshops. So I don't, if I'm teaching an undergrad class, I'll put together a packet, and I will always include Forever Overhead. And I think for whatever reason, a lot of my students have not read him. Usually there'll be like one person in the class, and then everybody else is, just not read a lot of stuff like that. So usually, they're pretty knocked out, and I think it's a really readable story for someone who hasn't read him before. It's a relatable story, and I think one of the reasons that I assign that, and that on the rare occasion that I've assigned Supposedly Fun Thing, is the attention to detail. It's just like this, like it's just a moment. That story is just a moment where this kid is standing on the diving board. I don't know that there's a mention of how much time has passed. In the kid's head, it feels like forever. You can imagine it's probably not much, but every smell, every sound, every feeling, in 8 pages or whatever it is, and in a different way in the nonfiction piece. I've had exercises where I've assigned students to take a day of their life and just scribble down notes all day. I've done it myself. And to me, at the bottom of it on both of those pieces is it's just about paying attention. It's just that the cruise ship. I mean, granted, you're going to see interesting things on a cruise ship, but I think in any given day, there are interesting things if you look. If you look at the bus driver or, whatever it is. When I did that sort of exercise for myself, I was teaching preschool. And, it's a lot of the same thing day after day after day, but I wrote down everything every kid said, everything we did, diapers, and, it was a great exercise. And so that's what I learned from him, is to pay attention,
Pay attention.
Yeah.
I can think of nothing more fun than getting a class together and reading Infinite Jest together. I mean, I've done this with Freedom and Half of a Yellow Sun, long books that it's kind of hard to do on your own, maybe. And I did it myself with the Infinite Summer.
You did?
On the web,
Wow.
yeah. Well, I didn't do it at the exact same time, but it's there. So as I was reading it, I was checking in just to sort of see at the end of chapter 1 what people had to say. And so I think it would be such a thrill to get a room of students and just say, meet you next week. We will have read 75 pages. I'm sure a lot of people.
And they do get excited about it too.
This woman is who I just met is teaching at UT, a class next year. So
Wow.
it's going to be great. That's going to be an amazing experience.
Wow.
Just to get to share.
I loved Infinite Summer. I felt, wow, this internet thing there might be something to it.
Because it can be a lonely book to be in the middle of,
Yeah.
Infinite Jest, and so what's great is years later people can still check right into that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great project.
yeah. And also, it's a book where you could use some handholds along the way sometimes,
Yeah.
and also just to not be alone when you're reading it. I remember reading Gravity's Rainbow alone in my little hovel of an apartment, and just wondering, does anybody else have this inside their head? Is there anyone I can talk to about this book? And to be able to talk to so many people about it must be a wonderful experience. Were there questions that you thought I should have asked that I haven't asked yet? What question were you fearing most?
Yeah, we were joking around at lunch that you were going to say, okay, on page 471
Yeah.
of Infinite Jest.
What does he mean when he says?
Yeah.
Right.
Some of the academic inquiries that are going on about
Yes.
his work scare the hell out of me. So I was afraid I was going to be discussing those.
With academic disquisition, inquisition.
Exactly.
No, that's not going to happen here.
But I think that's the best question you can ask anyone who's starting to read David Foster Wallace or who has read them for a lifetime. What do you love?
Yeah.
What about it do you love? Because there's so much.
Do you read his nonfiction differently from the way you read his fiction? You mentioned giving a supposedly fun thing. Elizabeth, you mentioned giving a supposedly fun thing to people, I think.
That's an interesting question. I don't think so. I mean, I just go into, anything that I'm going to read. And, Wallace was a person whose books I always bought on the first day, after the first one.
Which was the first one. So you read him in real time with every book.
Yes. Well,
including Infinity.
I bought
Everything and More?
Infinite Jest on the day that it came out. And then I had that kind of carrying it around problem. So I went back to it like a year. I read like 100 pages,
problem.
and then I went back to it a year later, and it's like, okay, I'm just gonna have to figure out how to get this book, transport it.
I can't remember whether it was Don DeLillo or John Updike who described Infinite Jest as ergonomically incorrect. One of them did.
Yes,
I think it was John
absolutely.
Updike.
But I always got his books the day that they came out, and I just read them because I wanted to read anything that he wrote, and so that's really the only way in which I approach it. I mean, I'm not much of a nonfiction writer, so it was really just for the enjoyment of it.
And I love, even his book reviews were often just so hilarious and accessible, really. I mean, that when he reviewed one of Updike's later books, and the last line of the essay is just that the major problem of this narrator is not all of these other issues, but it's that he doesn't know he's an asshole. God, you can write that in the New York Review of Books or wherever it was published. It was so refreshing and true.